We're in windy Wellington, New Zealand. It's the new year, and this is Courtney, who does LARP, who organizes LARPs, and who is part of the kind of the head organization or the central organization of LARPs in New Zealand. And we're going to talk about how people LARP in New Zealand, how many people LARP in New Zealand, and what it's like.
Yes.
So thank you, first of all, for taking the time. It's the 1st of January. I guess most people are still lying in bed.
Yes, thankfully I didn't stay up too late. We were playing Scythe all night.
And you didn't stay up late?
No, well, we hit midnight and then that was it.
So you're a proper all-around geek, board games, role-playing games, LARPing.
Yeah, I would consider myself versatile in terms of geekdom.
Yeah. When I looked up LARPing in New Zealand, I realized that there was this organization for LARP in New Zealand, and that was really easy to reach out and find someone. So you kind of, there is a group of people who organize this throughout the country. You're not kind of splintered away in groups?
Yes, so New Zealand LARPs is an incorporated society. So what that means is they are registered with our Ministry of Business and Innovation. NZ LARP serves as a central body for LARPs and supporting LARPs in the country. What that means is they fund LARPs and they provide gear. And they provide material support, there's a national body, so that's how you contacted me. I am the National Marketing Officer. But then there's all the regional subgroups in the main areas that there are members. So we have Auckland, Greater Waikato, Wellington, and then there's the southern body as well.
Okay, so in many places that I know, people always try to start something like that, and then they end up with lots of different smaller things that argue with each other, but you're kind of like a happy family, I suppose?
Happy enough. I think it helps that our LARPer population and our greater country population is relatively small, especially in comparison. So we have hundreds of LARPers, couple hundred, and out of those, the NZ LARPs members probably only tally to maybe about 30, 40, if that. So it's easier to make decisions and get along if there's less of you, I imagine. Was it too many cooks spoil the broth, as it were?
Yeah. I'd like to attribute it also to the Kiwi spirit, because you're a little laid back, little friendly. Yeah,
so New Zealand LARP started in 2005, 2006, so a bit ago, and it seem to have been created in good spirit, and being a corporate society means it's non-profit and no single member can benefit from what they're doing. So I think with that as a baseline, and the fact that the world regards Kiwis as a bit laid back, we kind of all go in as volunteers, as a purely volunteer-based society, and we all put a lot of passion into it, and so that means that we're that invested in it. We really, really want it to succeed, because all the game runners are all volunteers as well. No one really gets paid for any of this. So with that, there's a lot of emotional investment. People, I don't think, really want it to see crash and burn.
So you said that the LARPs themselves, the conventions, they're like 30, 40 people, smallish.
Yeah.
And what can I expect when I go to a New Zealand LARP? Is it going to be a whole weekend or just a day? And what kind of structure is there going to be?
So it really depends on what kind of LARP you would go to. The typical campaign LARPs, as they were, usually span over an entire weekend, so starting Friday night and ending about Sunday afternoon. The makeup of those tends to be divided into sort of categories. So you've got your LARP organisers, so you've got your GMs and anyone else who's helping them on the project team. Then you have your players. Players are the people who create their characters as per what the rules are, and then they'll go along and play. And then you have your crew as well. So the crew work side by side with the players and the project team and basically bring the worlds to life. So they're very reactive and proactive in both senses, in which they'll play the monsters, they'll play key NPCs, and they'll just sort of add that extra layer into our games that make them a bit more immersive. So some recent games, they can, if they have free time, they usually just come out as reoccurring characters who live and breathe in this world or town that the players are in, and gives that sort of realism to it, almost that these are people who live here in this world. And so when you come to a LARP of this structure, typically if you're a player, you sort of show up and the story will start. The onus is really heavily on the GMs to write a plot line for the weekend, and that plot line typically carries over to the course of the games, and games typically run about 5 or 6 games over the course of a weekend every 6 months in the country. So games typically last for about three years.
Okay.
And we have simultaneous ones that happen, just not at the same time. We have a lot of theatre form LARPs. Wellington especially is kind of the theatre form capital, in that it's the pre-written games with pre-written characters. You sign up, you attend about a 5-hour game with clear objectives and a setting. And you sort of, it's kind of the smaller side of LARPs, but I still quite enjoy them, sort of the murder mystery-esque type format, where you show up, a thing happens, and you as your pre-written character have to navigate in that setting. We do sometimes get big one-offs, so we have one coming up, which is a folk horror LARP, where you're people living in a 1950s town, and in the middle of the woods, and there may or may not be an effigy being burned, I'm told. But this won't be a continuous story. It's sort of a one-off event for people, but it is an entire weekend. And then you get one-day campaigns, which about 8 to 10 hours, but are a reoccurring story. So there's a lot of variety.
Yeah, that's when we talked before this, it sounded like you're mostly doing like kind of, I don't want to call it old school or classic or something, but how many LARPs started out worldwide.
Yeah.
You have a campaign, you have recurring characters, and I like that you call your NPCs the people crew. So they're the people who make the thing happen.
Yeah.
And then you also have like the murder mysteries and then like slightly Nordic LARPish, if you know that one.
There's definitely been a lot of comparisons made to Nordic LARPing, because New Zealand, how it started out, how I've been told, because LARPing predates, I think, my existence in this world, at least in New Zealand, specifically, worldwide probably as well. It was about the early 80s. Some people here got a magazine that basically outlined how people in the UK were doing LARP and how to build a rule set and some examples of that, and they decided to give it a go. And then we have LARPers who are from other countries, so the UK and United States, who came here quite early, and they helped form and introduce sort of styles and things like that, and it sort of formed into what New Zealand now quite enjoys, I think. So there's boffer combat at campaigns typically, but a lot of it is roleplay focused, and we incorporate the whole idea of NPCs and players rather than player versus player. Player versus player is not typically something that we do too much of here.
Okay. I'm wondering, how do you get your stuff? How do you get your gear? Because, you know, in Germany it's actually easy, because we actually, by now we have big warehouses who produce LARP clothing. But you're a bit far away from everything. Do you have people who produce this stuff for your community, or do you do a lot by hand? How does it work?
So we have a central gear supplier. So we only have one, but he runs an online and a physical store in Auckland. So he has contacts with people like Epic Armory and things like that, and can get a bunch of those gear. So in terms of getting weapons, it's relatively easy. If you want to get it through other suppliers that maybe don't go through that supplier, it is a bit costly in terms of shipping to get these items over here. But some people I mean, obviously you'll regard it as quite worth it if you spend $200 on shipping. Like, we still buy from Arm Street and companies like that. It's just expensive.
Even more expensive.
It's incredibly expensive. Customs. And then on top of that, we have a lot of very talented creators in the community who take commissions and can create beautiful costumes. For example, we have quite a talented custom weapon creator, and we wanted these claws made for this monster we were creating, but very specifically we wanted skeletal that was kind of like a black obsidian sort of make, and he managed to make these claws.
Pretty specific.
It is very specific. It was even harder because he was playing in the game and I could only give him very vague details of what I wanted, but not tell him why. Sometimes that's often it is. I'm not going to tell you why, but here's some money, please make this.
Because the community is quite small, so it might easily happen that someone who works for you to make this happen is also going to be a player.
Yes, it typically is the circles overlap, as it was. The Venn diagram is very short.
It's basically a circle, the Venn diagram.
It's almost a circle at this point, yeah.
Speaking of getting things come over here, which is very expensive, you told me that people from New Zealand actually go to Europe to LARP, so going to Mháire. I quite can't believe that it did actually fly all the way to Germany for one LARP.
Yeah, and some people in this country, quite a lot of us sort of see it as a big deal to go to an overseas LARP. So we had, I can't remember the name of it, but there was also the high seas one that was the pirate LARP on a ship. That we had someone go to, and that was kind of also a big deal. And Mháire is one that several LARPers have gone to. People plan entire holidays around it, especially if you're going to be in a plane for about an entire day one way. You typically want to get more out of it. But yeah, people have gone there. It varies wildly, I think, depending on the person, what year they went, and also just the fact that it's not quite the LARP experience in New Zealand that a lot of players find it quite interesting when they go there on this sort of structure, and that it's quite loose, I think, in comparison compared to how tightly structured New Zealand was. We have a schedule and we...
And you have a lot of plot to go through.
We have a lot of plot to go to. In some games, typically every single player has personal plot written for them on top of the general world plot, and then there's ambient plot that typically happens, like a farmer needs help with his cows or something like that. So there's a lot of layers and sort of coding to the types of plots that get sent out, whereas you go overseas, I don't know if it's quite the same. There's even plot around combats. So it's, I think New Zealand is sometimes kind of an intense experience in some ways, comparatively.
Comparatively to Mháire, where there's so many people that you can't really give everyone something to do. I wanted to talk a bit about your lab specifically and how it works, because in Germany, we can just go to a castle and have things like that. I kind of guess that you are more working with the awesome landscape that you have, because New Zealand, for people in Europe, is like the epitome of epic landscape, thanks to certain movies.
Yeah, a little bit. So again, we don't have castles. New Zealand's far too young in terms of colonized landscapes, but what we do have is, again, like you said, the beautiful nature and that scenery, but for the most part, at least our campaigns are held at campgrounds, so like a YMCA scout camp, and with that there'll be common buildings that we take a lot of great care into transforming with set dressing, props, and all sorts to create a space that is more like the world that we want to be in. So we don't have the luxury of, we have a medieval LARP, so we're going to a castle, or we have to either create that castle using the interior of a building, or we don't have it at a castle. Instead, it's in a small, sleepy town with a tavern and a wooden building, and we go from there. Castles might be off-screen and hand-waved. It's elsewhere. Which has happened. One of my housemates created a big gate structure for another group of organisers because the players were going to come to this great citadel, but of course we don't have such structures, so instead we put a gate in the middle of the woods, and so they had to try and get through that gate and its various traps, but there was still a gate and the players were very excited because there was some kind of structure.
And the rest of the citadel, you imagine?
You imagine, yes. We did hold a what we call like a day game. So day games are where you would go into a campaign, but you'd have a day version of that game that's like a small segment or a side story, and still relevant, but it's so you can achieve something that might take a bit of time, but you can't really fit into the game. And one was essentially a dungeon crawl in this place that they had unlocked that was only a gate at the game, but they instead hired this multi-level, multi-room venue and basically did put traps and all sorts of encounters in and locks in this building. I made the players go through and do puzzles and all that, pretending it was it was this building. It's a lot of theatre of the mind in this sense.
I love that, actually. I love that. That is how we started out and how we like to do our personal LARPs will be organized, and they are things you just have to have in your mind.
Yeah.
I have to ask about what kind of stories or settings you play, because my mind immediately goes to fantasy, classic fantasy. You have the Lord of the Rings landscape around you.
It's quite varied. So obviously classic fantasy is a staple in LARP and further sort of nerd culture. But a lot of games recently are sort of veering away from that. So one game we had that finished last year was called The Musketeers. It was based on the Dumas setting of the Three Musketeers. It was also, I believe, the first game that did a genre twist, in which halfway through the campaign they realised it was also a supernatural game with monsters and vampires, and it was secretly a continuation of the GM's previous LARP that was a vampire hunting fantasy LARP. So you can imagine these women in big court dresses with like muskets and pistol shooting vampires is basically what that was. One of the games I'm involved with is a Weird West LARP. So this is a recent one and quite a different genre to people use. So it's one of the few games that says you can't use shields. And that most people use guns or some kind of other melee weapon for combat. And for the most part, fantasy has been a reoccurring genre, but it seems a lot of people are sort of wanting to try new things with that. So we've got some games at the moment that will fill your fantasy need, but then we've also got a Viking time travel LARP with magic and the gods and stuff like that. So it's varied, I would say. So I think even despite the backdrop and everything, our LARPs don't tend to explore an awful lot of the landscape as people might imagine. In terms of venues for it, we don't really have a spare paddock we can go off to in the middle. For the most part, we tend to have to stick to campgrounds, and we can explore the surrounding areas, but it tends to be quite focused in terms of its venue. And it is still beautiful, but less being able to roam a countryside and more just having to go from A to B to B to C and then not get killed. Roam some paddocks, but hope that you don't get shot. In game. She's specify in game.
In game.
In game.
Yes. Your character.
Yes.
Hope your character doesn't get shot. Yeah. Do you think that this whole geeky community, the LARPing community, did it profit from New Zealand becoming kind of the fantasy capital of the world with Lord of the Rings and Hobbit movies, and with Weta sitting here right basically next to us or a little bit over there?
They're over there, very close. I'm not sure if they benefited too much from it. So I know we get a lot of tourism because of Lord of the Rings. I used to live near where the Gardens of Isengard were, so I totally get it. And round the corner from the green screen. So for the most part, we are very connected to Lord of the Rings in New Zealand, no matter where you go. But in terms of our hobby, I don't think much has really affected it. I can't really speak because I've only been LARPing for 7 years, and I say that as if that's not a long time. Comparatively, it's maybe not a long time. I'm only 25, so maybe that's why. But I think we've gotten some benefit from it in terms of we've got people like you who sort of come over here with Lord of the Rings being part of the draw, and then they end up showing up to a LARP and having a bit of a unique brief experience at one of our games, and then they get to go away with that. So I like to think that more people benefit than we do in terms of the experience, but we get to meet great people who come to this country. So I like to think we're the winners here.
I have to ask, and I'm sorry, are there no Lord of the Rings LARPs in New Zealand?
Not exactly. So I think part of the reason for that is, as New Zealanders, Lord of the Rings is basically everywhere. We kind of get our fill just by existing, I think, here. So it's quite common, especially around in Wellington or in other set-heavy places, to see tour buses with tourists and stuff go past, and a lot of companies would have used Lord of the Rings in their advertisement to sort of stay on the pulse of pop culture, I guess. And because of that, I feel our exposure to Lord of the Rings is enough that we don't really need to live it. That isn't to say that maybe someone really wants to run a Lord of the Rings LARP, and if they do, I'll probably go to that as well. But I think most of it is to do with the fact that it's just sort of everywhere for us in our little pocket of the world, and a lot of people have to travel quite far to come here to experience. For us, it's right here, and there's not many of us, so it's sort of just it's an ambient thing that sort of happens. And on top of that, the lore of Lord of the Rings is very specific. A lot of people know it very well, to the point of I wouldn't say obsession's the right word, but just very enthusiastically
let's
adoring.
put it like that.
Yes, enthusiastic about it, and it has a strong sort of emotional connection to them that if you got something wrong, I imagine it could make people upset. If you attended a game and it was meant to be a Lord of the Rings setting, and someone found something that you did that deviated from it, they would probably argue to the high heavens, I imagine. We've had some loose experience with this where you have to say it's loosely inspired by something. Otherwise, someone might turn around and say, well, in the setting, that didn't happen. This thing I want to do happened, so why can't I do it? So there's a lot of give and take you sort of have to have with intellectual property, so that you can run your own unique thing, because a lot of people want to do that as sort of game runners here, because for the most part in New Zealand, it is a story this person is writing, or people are writing, that's their own sort of creation, and you can take Lord of the Rings or anything else and sort of run with it, but at the end of the day, the product is kind of yours, and whatever you turn it into. And I think avoiding people seeing it as the thing that you took it from, rather than your own, is sort of something that people want to avoid. So, for example, in the Weird West LARP, I help run. Part of it was loosely inspired by a world called Malifaux, which is a word games setting. But for a long time, for shorthand, it was called the Malifaux LARP, as we were planning it, which of course invited a few things of people going, well, I want to do this, this, and this, and we had it included in our setting because we had taken the Malifaux setting and then completely transformed it into a world that not only we wanted, but would actually work for the amount of people we had, the venue we would have, and what we could fizz rep. Because there's a certain amount, like steam trains, we can't quite get for a weekend. Especially not running through a town that everyone can also inhabit. And the sort of high magic that can come with that. So I think, the main reason probably, or the main reasons that Lord of the Rings isn't really a LARP here, or is mostly involved in some kind of setting, is the enthusiasm people would have for the setting that might derive from the story the game master is trying to tell, and on top of that, the fact that it's just such an ambient presence in New Zealand that we don't need to fill in other ways. A lot of us have New Zealand, Lord of the Rings like costumes, because some may have been left over and sold, or there have been other productions here.
That's very handy.
There have been other productions here that use either a lot of costumes on, or similar costumes, like Legend of the Seeker, I think is.
That was produced here at Sam Raimi series.
Yeah, so a bunch of us have gear from that production because they just sold it, and LARPers were the people who mostly came and bought it. So I have a cloak from it. I couldn't tell you who wore it in the production, but I have it, and a bunch of us have boots from it, and belts, and all sorts of various things that were from the show.
That's a huge plus. that you have the companies here to then just sell their leftover stuff.
They weren't going to lug it back, and they probably weren't going to use it for anything else. So we sort of benefited at least from that.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Oh, talking about high magic and adapting a setting for how you want to play. For instance, the Malifaux setting. What do you do rules-wise? As with the NZ LARP organization, do you have one rule set that everyone uses, or does every game master or group do their own?
Rules are almost always created from scratch. So there might be a formula or a template that you start with, but it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. So a Weird West LARP might have a completely different rule set from a high fantasy, on account of there being guns and dynamite, and not wizards quite so much. So the process tends to be, you look at existing rules such as calls or how they've done things that you like from an existing setting, and you tend to adapt it to what you need. So I know a lot of people have sort of done that, and over time there is some general basics that a lot of LARPs in New Zealand tend to follow. So things like out of character, welfare and safety typically is stock standard. New Zealand LARP also provides a code of conduct, so if it is a New Zealand LARP's project, you have to adhere to this code of conduct as well, out of character. On top of that, you've got calls that may be very standard across the board, like resist, or maybe a cripple call, and things like that, or
So you do the systems with calls where you call out what effect you cause, and
it tends to be a deliver a call, and then you verbalize the call to highlight what has happened. So in the Viking LARP, it has magic. Some magic wielders, which they make braids using and calling upon their ancestors into the braids. And then they may release it, and one of the examples of calls might be that you weave this big braid, and then you say, by the power of my ancestors, fear. And that means that anyone in front of you who can see you and heard that has to run immediately from you. So fear is kind of a standard call that people know that means I'm scared of that thing. If I receive that, I have to run. We reintroduced a call that hadn't been used in a while in our game called Agony. Which is you basically have to, you're in pain for 5 seconds. You can roleplay that however you feel your character would, but you can't do anything for 5 seconds. And that's usually a result of a battle medic snapping your leg back into place or something, or performing a procedure and they don't give you whiskey first. You then yell out in pain. And the reason we introduced that call as part of forming our rule set is historically, in terms of in the 1800s, because it's set in the mid-1800s, medicine was bad.
We can agree on that.
Yes, medicine was very bad. I was inspired when I came up with medical system by, there's a podcast called Sawbones by Dr. Sydney McElroy and her husband, Justin McElroy, as well as the other various media that exist that has sort of medicine practice in there. And I thought, what was the best way to represent how bad it was for the patient? And one was, yeah, you can get quick treatment, but it's going to hurt real bad. You won't be able to do anything for a few seconds, so you can't just get up and go. And also there's a chance afterwards when the battle dies down that it might actually just completely undo itself, and you have to get it seen to by a doctor who will do the more careful, practiced one. There's also, we borrowed from Malifaux a fate draw. So our game has an element of chance at every turn.
Oh, okay, so you draw cards to see whether a spell works or something?
Less of a spell and more people like the doctors, they'll have a fate deck, and it's the outcome of their surgery succeeding or not. So typically their surgery will succeed as a baseline, but there may or may not be a consequence of it. Our game is called Consequence, so I was like, I got to think of a different word, but no, it's a good word. So for example, they might flip the wrong thing and their thing is now infected. So they have to deal with the infection now, otherwise the person will get sick and then die. And so then there are extreme results. So a black joker and a red joker, kind of like rolling a nat 1 and a nat 20. A nat 1, so a black joker would mean that the patient just dies on you. So there's always a risk whenever you do stuff, and it's been very well received.
Okay, so you actually have like a little bit of tabletop role-playing elements in your game system. Does that carry over to character creation or something? Do you have like an elaborate system with you spend these points or you do that, or how do you go with it?
So it's typically a bit like that. So you go through the hierarchy. So you pick, if there happens to be a race, you typically pick that as a baseline. Then you have your classes, I guess, which some might have a fast and loose rule set in which you can just pick a bunch of different things, but people will typically structure them around that sort of class system. They go, well, I want to be a fighter, so I'm only going to pick fighting things. Or I want to be a caster, so I'm only going to pick the casting things, rather than go, I don't know, so I'm just going to pick a bunch of stuff. Some rule sets may or may not have like an XP system, which you can pick X amount at character creation, and then as the games go on, you can pick up one or two more things. So some games will have sort of categories or classes. So our game has 7 that cover a wide variety that we could adapt from the Malifaux tabletop rule set and what we thought would typically be enjoyable in a Wild West American setting. So you've got, you know, your gunslingers, and you've got your under the soldier archetype, as well as your brute enforcers, and then you've got your researcher one, which has journalist or academic. So your journalists are your social class, and then the academics are the book classes. Then you've got your pioneers, so you've got your rangers and your prospectors, and they do different things depending, and they're also resource gatherers. And then you've got, in other LARPs, you can do, I'm a courtier, so I'm going to have courtier associated abilities, but then I have all this list of other free abilities I can pick from and choose, or spells that I can pick up for an XP each game or something like that. So it varies between each game, but you typically do have a method in which you build your character first and have abilities to start with.
And then do you work with kind of a point system, how much damage you can take? And do you have to kind of count down in your head your hit points?
So most LARPs is a 1 hit is 1 point. We've moved to like low HP or hit point totals. So the max in most games you might get is maybe 3 or 4. And because 1 hit is one thing, the tougher you are, the more hits you can withstand. But the minimum is 2, so you can get hit twice and then drop. There may be some rules in which you can do more damage, but you'd have to call it if you did, so you'd say 2 or something, but that's very rare, I think.
That's for German LARPs. That's very old school. That's how we did it in the 90s, where I fell asleep in a tent to a chorus outside of 2, 3, holy. That's the change. But so you don't have like these LARPs where you do not work with real rule systems and points or anything at all, where it's just acting. And in these bigger things?
So roleplay is quite heavy in a lot of our games, and it's quite a focus. Like we have boffer combat with foam weapons, but it's typically not the focus. So roleplay tends to be it. There can be abilities, which is you have to roleplay doing stuff and then you get a benefit from an ability. So a doctor will have to roleplay doing surgery for 3 minutes in order to then heal someone. And a lot of people, it's opt-in the amount you want, but a lot of people, I mean, LARPers want to kind of go as far as they can. So they'll get LARP-safe surgery tools, and they'll have like a coat, and they'll get fake blood. Some people make like inside pockets, which they can put their hand in and pull things out, and some people made removable bullets so that they could bloody it up, put it in, and then surgically remove what looks like a dented bullet that had been fired into the person. So it's really we rules give the minimum sort of mechanical requirements, but it's really the LARPers who sort of make it in terms of how much roleplay they want to put into it. So some rules might just do 2 minutes role playing, and if the person's tired, maybe they won't do it intensely. But if it's role play making a potion, some people have mortar and pestles, and they'll bring their own herbs to then grind, and then they'll put into like containers and mix things together. And in terms of set dressing, we sometimes have whole labs and surgeries set up. So people can go and do that. So there's a mixture. There's some that's just directly like, I do this cool, and then others that require role play in order for them to gain the benefit of it.
Okay. Thank you very much. There's this, actually, this sounds like I enjoy a New Zealand LARP a lot. Really?
I'm glad. You should come to some.
Yeah, we missed every one that was around New Year's by a week or two.
Yeah, typically people sort of want their own lives around this time. The next lot of LARPs don't start up until February.
Yeah. So, well, we've been talking about maybe coming back, so next time we might schedule this a little bit more in advance. And now I know someone here, then I can call up. Another way around, you just if you ever happen to be in the vicinity of Germany,
I'll let you know.
Yeah, we'll be happy to show you a little bit of our LARPing situation and what we can do with castles and old mansions and things like that.
It'd be a very unique and I think a very great experience, especially now that I know someone.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.